A teacher? That's not a career. That's babysitting with homework. My father's voice carried over the clinking of expensive crystal and the low murmur of 70 guests gathered in his sprawling backyard. He stood at the head of the long banquet table, holding a glass of vintage champagne, supposedly giving a heartfelt toast for his and my mother's 50th wedding anniversary. But instead of looking at his wife of 5 decades, his cold, calculating eyes were locked dead onto my husband, Daniel. The entire backyard went dead silent. 70 people, family friends, wealthy business partners, and local socialites stopped eating. They looked at my father, who wore a smug smirk, and then they looked at Daniel. The evening air suddenly felt heavy and suffocating. I felt my face burn with a sudden, intense heat, a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious anger. I wanted to stand up and scream at him, to grab my family and walk out, but I was momentarily frozen in pure shock. Sitting right between Daniel and me was our 6-year-old son, Lucas. Noticing the sudden drop in conversation, Lucas looked around at the silent, staring crowd, then up at his grandfather, and finally at his dad. He reached out and pulled on Daniel's shirt sleeve. "Daddy," Lucas whispered, though in the dead silence of the party, everyone at the table heard it clearly. "Why is Grandpa laughing at you?" Daniel didn't say a word. He didn't yell across the table. He didn't try to desperately defend himself or his career. He just looked down at our young son with a gentle, reassuring expression and placed his hand warmly over Lucas's small hand at that exact moment. I thought my father had won. I thought he had successfully humiliated the man I loved in front of everyone who mattered in his elitist, money-driven circle. My father took a slow sip of his champagne, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. But my father didn't know the truth. He didn't know who he was messing with, and he had no idea what was coming. Exactly 48 hours later, my father would be forced to sit in a massive auditorium surrounded by 600 people. He would sit completely silent, watching that same man he had just publicly mocked receive an award he could never, ever buy with all his millions. To understand how we ended up at that terrible, humiliating dinner table, you have to understand who my father is, and exactly what happened 6 years ago. I work as an emergency room doctor, and Daniel is a high school history teacher. My father is a highly successful real estate businessman who has spent his entire life accumulating wealth. For as long as I can remember, my father has operated under one strict personal philosophy. He equates money directly to human value. If you have money, you demand respect. If you don't, you are nobody. My mother is the exact opposite. She has always been the peacemaker of the family, the quiet woman who constantly tries to smooth over my father's harsh, rough edges. But she never stood up to him. Daniel, on the other hand, is the most grounded, calm person I have ever known. He doesn't like to argue, he never raises his voice, and he absolutely does not care about keeping up with the wealthy lifestyle my father worships. 6 years ago, I stood in my father's lavish home office. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing some financial documents. I had just happily told him that Daniel and I were engaged to be married. He didn't stand up to hug me. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't even smile. He just put down his expensive pen, looked at me with total disgust, and delivered a cold ultimatum. "If you marry a teacher, don't come back," he said flatly. I thought he was trying to scare me. I was a doctor making a very good salary. Why did my husband need to be a millionaire? But my father didn't joke about money and social status. He told me I was throwing my life away by tying myself to a financial anchor. I told him I loved Daniel. He pointed to the office door. So I left. I married Daniel anyway. We had a beautiful, small wedding in a local botanical garden. Daniel's family was there. My friends from the hospital were there. My parents were not. For 6 long years, my father kept his word. Our family completely cut contact. We didn't speak. We didn't visit. During those 6 years, Daniel and I built a beautiful, happy life together. We bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. I worked grueling, exhausting shifts in the ER, seeing people on the worst days of their lives. Whenever I came home totally drained, Daniel was always there, steady and supportive. We welcomed our son, Lucas, into the world, and he became the absolute center of our universe. I missed my mother terribly, but I knew she wouldn't dare break my father's rules. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. I was taking a quick coffee break at the hospital. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it anyway. Elena! It was my mother. Her voice was shaking and fragile. I hadn't heard her speak in over 2,000 days. Mom? I asked, my heart suddenly pounding violently against my ribs. Is everything okay? Is someone hurt? No, everyone is fine, she said quickly, her voice cracking. Then she started crying softly into the receiver. I miss you so much, Elena. I sat down heavily on a bench in the hospital hallway. I miss you too, Mom. We talked for a few emotional minutes, just catching up on basic details of our lives. Then she finally got to the real reason for her sudden phone call. Your father and I are celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary next month, she said, her tone turning pleading. We are hosting a big party at the house. I want you to come. We both want you to come. I gripped my phone tightly, shaking my head even though she couldn't see me. Mom, you know I can't do that. Dad made his position very clear 6 years ago. He's changed, Elena, she pleaded desperately. He talks about you all the time now. And he wants to meet Lucas. He misses the grandson he's never even met. He doesn't have a grandson, I replied, feeling a sudden, protective surge of anger. He has never even seen a picture of Lucas. He chose to throw us away. Please, my mother cried, her voice breaking completely. We kept your old room exactly the same as the day you left. We even set up the guest room right next to it as a nursery for Lucas. The crib is already in there. The toys are in there. Your father bought them himself. Please, Elena, just come for the weekend. Bring Daniel. Bring Lucas. Let us be a family again. I felt a massive lump form in my throat. I didn't give her a yes or a no right away. I told her I was incredibly conflicted, that I had to think about it carefully, and most importantly, I needed to talk to my husband. When I got home that evening, Daniel was sitting at our small kitchen table. He was surrounded by tall stacks of history essays, holding a red grading pen. He looked up and smiled his warm, easy smile when I walked in. I sat down across from him, took a deep breath, and told him everything about the phone call. I told him what my mother had said, about the nursery waiting for Lucas, about my father supposedly softening in his old age, and about the big anniversary party. I was completely torn. A part of me desperately wanted to see my childhood home again. A part of me wanted my little boy to know his grandparents. But another, much louder part of me remembered the cold, dismissive look on my father's face when he kicked me out. I didn't want to expose Daniel to that kind of toxic disrespect again. I don't think we should go, I said, finally rubbing my temples. It's a trap. My father doesn't change. He just wants to show off his perfect family at his big party. Daniel put down his red pen. He looked at me with that steady, deeply calm expression of his. He didn't look angry, defensive, or insecure. Elena, he said quietly, it's your parents. It's their 50th anniversary. That is a massive milestone. But the way he treated you, I don't care about how he treated me, Daniel interrupted gently, reaching across the table to take my hand. I care about you. If you want to go and see your mother, then we will go. I will stand right beside you the entire time. I looked at our joined hands, still feeling anxious. Are you sure? He might say something. He might try to make you feel small. Daniel smiled a little and picked his pen back up, completely unbothered. He can try, but listen to me. If you want to go, we go. But I won't pretend to be someone I'm not. He meant every single word. Daniel was fiercely proud of what he did for a living. He loved teaching. He didn't care about expensive watches, luxury cars, or proving his worth through a bank account. He wasn't going to put on a fake show for my father, and he certainly wasn't going to apologize for his career, taking a massive leap of faith. We decided to pack our bags that Friday. We were going back to the exact house I was kicked out of 6 years ago. We were stepping right back into the lion's den. We pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of my childhood home late Friday afternoon. The house looked exactly the same, an imposing brick mansion sitting on 2 acres of perfectly manicured lawn. The neighborhood was just as quiet, wealthy, and exclusive as I remembered from my teenage years. My stomach tied itself into tight, painful knots the moment Daniel put our modest car in park next to a row of luxury vehicles that my mother rushed out the front door before we even unbuckled our seatbelts. She was crying hysterically, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck and then immediately dropping to her knees to hug Lucas. But my father stood firmly up on the front porch. He didn't come down the steps to greet us. When we finally walked up to him, he gave me a stiff, formal hug. Then he looked at Daniel. He didn't shake his hand or offer a welcoming smile. He just gave a cold, barely noticeable nod.my mother, trying desperately to break the incredible tension, dragged us upstairs to show us the rooms. She had kept my old bedroom exactly the way I left it 6 years ago, right down to the specific books on the shelf. And right next door, she proudly pushed open a heavy oak door to show us the nursery they had built for Lucas. It was filled with incredibly expensive toys, a handcrafted wooden crib, and a massive wardrobe. It was a beautiful room, but walking through it felt incredibly heavy and suffocating, like walking through a museum of a life we never lived because of my father's stubborn pride. The real trouble started during our first dinner that Friday night. It was just the 5 of us sitting at the massive dining room table. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation was painfully forced, mostly just my mother asking polite questions about Lucas's kindergarten classes. Then, my father cleared his throat, put down his silver fork, and purposely shifted the topic. He brought up Ryan Caldwell. Ryan was a guy I went to college with, a man who came from a family with money that rivaled my father's empire. Ryan had spent 2 years aggressively pursuing me, but I never had any romantic interest in him whatsoever. My father, however, absolutely adored him, and had always wanted him as a son-in-law. My father spent the entire dinner detailing Ryan's recent financial conquests. He talked loudly about a massive luxury resort Ryan had just bought out west. He talked about Ryan's brand new 80-foot yacht. He went on and on about Ryan's rapidly expanding commercial real estate portfolio. And every single time my father mentioned a massive dollar amount or a new business acquisition, his eyes would dart across the table, locking directly onto Daniel. He wanted to make sure Daniel heard every single word about the incredibly wealthy man I could have married. Daniel just quietly ate his steak, completely ignoring the obvious, insulting bait that I woke up the next morning feeling a deep, heavy sense of dread. The house was already buzzing with professional caterers and florists setting up for the massive anniversary party in the backyard. I was in the kitchen getting a cup of coffee when I saw the seating chart left out on the marble island. I looked for my name, and then I looked at the name printed on the card right next to mine. It was Ryan Caldwell that I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I quickly looked down the rest of the table on the chart. Daniel was seated on the complete opposite side, as far away from me as physically possible. This wasn't an accident. I looked out the kitchen window and saw my father standing on the patio, talking privately with Ryan, who had apparently arrived very early. They were laughing loudly and patting each other on the back like old war buddies. When my mother walked into the kitchen a moment later and saw me holding the seating chart, she immediately turned around and walked out. She completely avoided my eyes. She knew exactly what my father was doing, and she was too terrified of his temper to stop it. By 6 o'clock that evening, the backyard was packed. There were 70 guests dressed in expensive tailored suits and designer dresses. The backyard was decorated beautifully with floating lights, massive floral arrangements, and a full live jazz band. When Ryan officially made his grand entrance to the party, my father practically threw a parade for him. He greeted Ryan with a massive, enthusiastic hug, a greeting that was much warmer and louder than the cold nod he had given his own son-in-law the day before. He paraded Ryan around to all the wealthy business partners, introducing him proudly. Meanwhile, Daniel stood quietly near the edge of the patio, holding Lucas's hand, just watching the ridiculous spectacle with a calm expression. Eventually, everyone was seated for the grand dinner. I had tracked down the event coordinator and forced her to move Daniel's chair right next to mine, which earned me a furious, burning glare from my father across the yard. After the first course was cleared, my father stood up at the head of the long table. He tapped his crystal champagne glass with a silver spoon. The 70 guests went completely quiet, turning their attention to him. He gave a short, generic speech about his 50-year marriage, but then his cold eyes found Daniel. He smiled, but it was a cruel, calculating, shark-like smile. He looked right at Daniel, and pretending to make polite conversation in front of his wealthy friends, asked loudly what Daniel was doing for a living these days. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked my father dead in the eye and said calmly, "I teach history." My father let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed across the silent yard. He took a slow sip of his expensive drink, looked around at his friends to make sure they were all listening, and delivered the exact line he had probably been practicing all week. "So you babysit teenagers for peanuts," my father said. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. 70 people stopped breathing. Nobody moved a muscle. That was the exact moment Lucas tugged on Daniel's sleeve and asked, "Why is Grandpa laughing at you?" I was shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. I was ready to flip the heavy table, grab my father by his expensive tie, and scream at him until my lungs completely gave out. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to finally snap, waiting for him to defend his honor, his career, and his family. I wanted him to yell. I wanted him to fight back, but Daniel didn't do any of that. He didn't argue with my father. He didn't raise his voice to explain the profound value of education or defend his life choices. He didn't even look at my father anymore. He just looked down at our confused 6-year-old son. He smiled warmly, completely ignoring the 70 pairs of judgmental eyes burning into him. "Want to go see the fireflies?" Daniel asked Lucas softly. Lucas nodded eagerly, his face lighting up. Daniel stood up, took Lucas by the hand, and without saying a single word to my father, to Ryan, or to anyone else sitting at that table, he turned his back and walked out into the dark yard. It was the most dignified, deeply frustrating, and incredibly powerful exit I had ever seen, and it left my father and his entire table of wealthy friends choking on their own awkward, heavy silence. The rest of the dinner was a complete blur. I sat there in silence, my hands gripping the linen napkin in my lap, so tightly my knuckles turned bright white. My father and Ryan continued to talk loudly, completely ignoring the empty seats where my husband and son had been sitting just moments before. The sheer disrespect was suffocating. I couldn't stomach another second of it. I abruptly pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the stone patio, and walked back into the house without saying a single word to my father or his wealthy guests. I retreated to the large, empty kitchen, leaning against the cool marble countertops and trying desperately to catch my breath. I was shaking with a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious anger. That was when my older sister walked through the swinging kitchen doors. My sister and I had never been particularly close, mostly because she had always played by my father's rules. She married a corporate lawyer, lived in a gated community, and never caused any trouble. But as she stood in the kitchen looking at me, her expression wasn't condescending or judgmental. She actually looked deeply guilty. "He didn't just invite Ryan at the last minute, Elena," she said quietly, making sure the kitchen doors were completely shut behind her. I looked up at her, my heart sinking. "What are you talking about?" My sister crossed her arms, refusing to meet my eyes directly. She confessed the entire, sickening truth. She told me that our father had personally called Ryan Caldwell weeks before the anniversary party. This wasn't a coincidence, and it certainly wasn't just a friendly invitation. My father had specifically orchestrated this entire weekend with one incredibly cruel goal in mind. He explicitly told my sister that he wanted me to see exactly what I gave up when I chose to marry a high school teacher, but it got significantly worse. My sister took a deep breath and revealed the most humiliating detail of all. My father hadn't just invited Ryan to show off his wealth. He had actually been walking around his country club and his corporate boardrooms, telling all of his wealthy friends and business partners that my marriage was failing. He actively spread a completely fabricated rumor that Daniel and I were on the verge of getting a divorce. He told everyone that I was miserable, that I was struggling financially, and that this anniversary party was his grand opportunity to finally rescue me from a terrible mistake. The entire dinner, the seating chart, the loud conversations about luxury resorts, it was all a massive, carefully staged theatrical production. I felt physically sick to my stomach. My own father had turned my life, my marriage, and my family into a pathetic sideshow for his rich friends. He had used my mother's genuine desire to see her grandson as a twisted bait to lure me back into his house, just so he could publicly humiliate the man I loved. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. When I went upstairs to our room, Daniel was already in bed, reading a book while Lucas slept soundly in the small cot next to him. I sat on the edge of the bed and told Daniel everything my sister had just revealed. I was crying hot, angry tears, apologizing repeatedly for dragging him into this toxic nightmare. Daniel just put his book down, pulled me into a tight hug, and told me we would pack our bags first thing in the morning. He wasn't angry. He was just completely done. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The massive catering tents in the backyard were being disassembled by a sleepy crew of workers. I walked downstairs holding Lucas by the hand, fully intending to grab our bags from the hallway, walk out the front door, and never look back. But my father was already sitting at the large breakfast table in the sunroom, drinking a cup of black coffee and reading the Sunday paper. He looked up as we walked in. He didn't look remorseful. He didn't look like a man who had crossed a massive line the night before. He looked incredibly smug, like a chess player who thought he had just won the game. Daniel walked into the sunroom right behind us, carrying our 2 small suitcases. He set them down quietly near the doorway. My father slowly lowered his newspaper. He looked at the suitcases, then at Daniel, and finally down at my 6-year-old son. Father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass table, and looked directly into Lucas's innocent eyes. He smiled that same cold, calculating smile from the night before. "You know, Lucas," my father said, his voice dripping with fake, sickening sweetness, "if your dad had a real job, you'd have a much bigger house to play in." The air in the room instantly vanished. It was the final, unforgivable insult. He couldn't break Daniel, and he couldn't break me, so he was actively trying to poison the mind of a little boy who didn't understand anything about money, status, or ego. Something inside of me completely shattered. 6 years of trying to keep the peace. 6 years of feeling guilty for hurting my mother. 6 years of wondering if I should try to fix this broken relationship. It all instantly evaporated. I didn't care that he was my father. I didn't care about his money or his influence that I took a very deliberate step forward, putting myself directly between my father and my son. I looked down at the man who had raised me, feeling absolutely nothing but pure disgust. "You don't get to talk to my son about his father that way," I said firmly. My voice wasn't shaking anymore. It was dangerously calm and incredibly loud. "You do not ever get to speak to my child about the man who actually raises him, loves him, and shows up for him every single day." My father's face immediately flushed bright red. He wasn't used to people speaking to him like that. He was used to people cowering, apologizing, and begging for his approval. He slammed his coffee mug down on the glass table, so hard I thought the glass would shatter. He stood up, towering over the table, his eyes burning with absolute fury. "I am trying to help you," he shouted, dropping the calm, smug facade completely. "I am trying to show you the massive mistake you made. You are a doctor, Elena. You could have had everything. You could have had a husband who actually provides for you instead of dragging you down into a pathetic, mediocre life. Daniel provides everything we need." I fired right back, not stepping away. "He is a good, decent man. Something you clearly know absolutely nothing about." My father pointed a shaking, furious finger toward the hallway where our bags were sitting. He resorted to the exact same tactic he had used 6 years ago when I stood in his mahogany office. He thought he could bully me into submission with threats. "If you walk out that door right now," my father yelled, his voice echoing loudly through the quiet, expensive house, "don't you ever come back." I looked at his angry, red face. I thought about the ridiculous seating chart, the fake divorce rumors, and the pathetic attempt to use a wealthy college guy to make my husband jealous. And then I looked at Daniel, who was standing quietly by the door, holding Lucas's hand, waiting for me. He looked perfectly at peace that I turned back to my father and gave him a cold, hard stare. "You said that exact same thing to me 6 years ago," I replied evenly. "And I survived." I didn't wait for his response. I didn't want to hear another word out of his mouth. I turned around, grabbed my purse from the counter, and walked straight toward my husband and son. Daniel picked up the suitcases, opened the heavy front door, and we walked out into the crisp morning air. My mother was standing at the top of the sweeping staircase, clutching the wooden railing and sobbing uncontrollably. She had heard the entire screaming match, but just like always, she didn't come downstairs to intervene. She didn't stand up for me, and she didn't stand up to him. I felt a sharp pang of sadness for her, knowing she was trapped in that massive, empty house with a man who valued his ego over his own flesh and blood. But I couldn't save her. I had to protect my own family, so we loaded the suitcases into the trunk of our modest car. Lucas climbed into the back seat, buckling his seatbelt tightly. Daniel closed the trunk, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. I sat in the passenger seat, taking a massive, deep breath as the heavy doors closed, shutting out the toxic environment we had just escaped. Daniel started the engine. He didn't look back at the massive brick mansion. He just put the car in drive and steered us slowly down the long, sweeping driveway. The drive home was incredibly quiet. We were all completely exhausted, emotionally drained from the horrible weekend. But as we pulled onto the main highway, heading back toward our quiet neighborhood and our perfectly normal, happy life, I felt a massive, undeniable weight lift completely off my shoulders that I thought the drama was finally over. I thought we had closed the door on my father's ridiculous, money-obsessed world forever. I thought the worst part of the story was finally behind us, but I was wrong. The most important part of the story hadn't even started yet. Because later that exact same day, Daniel would finally open a sealed, confidential envelope he had been hiding in his work bag for over a month, and the absolute truth about his mediocre teaching career was about to be broadcast to the entire state. We pulled into our own small, cracked concrete driveway just as the afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the neighbor's house. Our home was absolutely nothing like my father's sprawling, gated estate. We didn't have perfectly manicured lawns, we didn't have a massive mahogany front door, and we certainly didn't have expensive sports cars parked out front. But as I walked up the simple wooden steps and unlocked the front door, a massive wave of intense relief washed entirely over me. This was our safe space. This was a home built on actual love and mutual respect, not a cold museum designed strictly to intimidate visitors and flaunt bank accounts. Lucas ran straight to his bedroom to play with his battered, totally normal plastic toy cars, completely unbothered by the dramatic morning we had just experienced. Daniel carried our 2 small suitcases into the hallway, setting them down quietly. He let out a long, heavy sigh, rolling his broad shoulders to release the deep physical tension that had been building up all weekend. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a large glass of cold water, and just leaned heavily against the counter, staring blankly at the wall. My mind was still racing, playing the horrible argument with my father over and over again on an endless, exhausting loop. Daniel walked into the kitchen a few minutes later. He was carrying his worn-out leather messenger bag, the one he always used to bring his heavy stacks of history papers home from the high school. He set the bag down on the small wooden kitchen table and started pulling out a few folders. That was when I noticed it. Tucked deep inside the front pocket of his work bag was a thick, pristine white envelope. It wasn't a standard bill or a piece of junk mail. It was a heavy, official-looking document with a shiny gold seal of the State Department of Education pressed firmly into the top left corner. It looked completely out of place among his coffee-stained lesson plans and student essays that I walked over to the table and pointed at it. "What is that?" I asked, my voice still slightly raspy from yelling at my father earlier that morning. Daniel looked down at the envelope. For the first time all weekend, a genuine, slightly embarrassed flush of color crept up his neck. He suddenly looked like a teenager who had just been caught hiding something. He didn't answer me right away. He just picked up the thick envelope, rubbed his thumb quietly over the gold seal, and then slowly handed it across the table to me. "I got this in the mail at the school office about a month ago," he said quietly, pulling out a kitchen chair and sitting down. "I actually haven't even opened it yet, but the principal called me into his office the day it arrived and gave me the news off the record." I looked at him, feeling incredibly confused. I slid my finger under the flap of the envelope and tore it open. Daniel opened the envelope to reveal a thick stack of official, heavy stock papers. I pulled out the crisp letters and unfolded them. The very first page had his full name printed in large, bold letters across the top, followed by a long, formal congratulatory message from the governor's office that MYI scanned the dense paragraphs quickly, trying to make sense of the official jargon. And then I saw the massive, bolded headlines sitting right in the middle of the page. I literally stopped breathing for a second. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and read the sentence again just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from sheer exhaustion that he had been officially selected as the state teacher of the year that I dropped the paper onto the table. My jaw practically hit the floor. This wasn't just a small, local certificate handed out in a school cafeteria. This was the absolute highest, most prestigious educational honor in the entire state. It meant he had been nominated by hundreds of his own peers, extensively reviewed by a massive state board, and ultimately chosen out of tens of thousands of other educators. It was a monumental, life-changing achievement. "Daniel," I whispered, absolutely stunned. "This is This is incredible. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't we celebrate this a month ago? He rubbed the back of his neck, looking genuinely incredibly humble. I wanted to wait until it was totally official. The state board is hosting a huge banquet on Monday night. The principal told me they are officially presenting the award then, and he wanted me to keep it completely quiet until the actual ceremony. I stared at the paper, and then my mind violently snapped back to the horrific events of the previous night. I thought about the massive anniversary party. I thought about my father standing at the head of that long banquet table, clinking his expensive crystal glass, and publicly mocking Daniel in front of 70 wealthy guests. I thought about my father laughing in Daniel's face, loudly calling his career a pathetic babysitting gig. At a sudden, overwhelming wave of fresh anger hit me. "Wait a minute," I said, my voice rising sharply as I looked at him. "You knew about this yesterday. You knew you had just won the State Teacher of the Year award when my father was sitting there humiliating you in front of his rich friends. You knew it when he told Lucas that you didn't have a real job." Daniel nodded slowly, perfectly calm. "Why didn't you say anything?" I nearly shouted, throwing my hands up in sheer, aggressive frustration. "Daniel, you could have completely shut him down. You could have pulled this letter out, slammed it on his expensive dinner table, and made him look like an absolute fool in front of every single person he tries so desperately to impress. Why did you just sit there and take his abuse when you had the ultimate trump card sitting right in your bag?" Daniel looked up at me. His eyes were incredibly steady, completely devoid of any ego, arrogance, or anger. He reached across the small kitchen table and took my hand, squeezing it gently to calm me down. He looked at me and said he didn't want it to look like he was proving something to my father. "Elena," he said softly, his voice grounding me instantly. If I had thrown that award in his face last night, I would have been playing his exact game. I would have been acting like my entire worth as a human being is measured by a fancy title or a piece of paper. Your father desperately needs constant validation from other people to feel important. I don't. I stood there in the kitchen, completely silenced. The sheer depth of his quiet confidence was staggering. He didn't need to loudly brag to 70 strangers to validate his life choices. He knew exactly who he was. He knew exactly the profound value of his work, and he absolutely refused to lower himself to my father's toxic, pathetic level just to score a cheap, temporary victory at a dinner party. Besides, Daniel added with a small, knowing smile, leaning back in his chair, the principal gave me 4 VIP front-row tickets for the official awards ceremony on Monday night. It's going to be a huge event with over 600 people. He pointed to the envelope resting on the table. I looked inside and saw 4 heavy, glossy, silver-foil tickets tucked neatly into the bottom. We only needed 2. I looked at the tickets, then I looked at my husband, and a sudden, brilliant idea formed in my mind. Daniel didn't want to play my father's game, and he didn't want to weaponize his massive achievement. But I was not nearly as forgiving. My father had actively tried to destroy my marriage this weekend. He had actively tried to poison my son's mind. He needed a massive reality check, and I was going to make absolutely sure he got one. I grabbed my phone from the counter, took a clear picture of 2 of the VIP tickets, and sent a text message directly to my mother. I didn't type a long, emotional paragraph. I didn't beg them to come. I just typed the exact address of the massive downtown auditorium, the exact time of the event, and one single, incredibly firm sentence that if Dad wants to see what a real man's career actually looks like, you will both be in these front row seats on Monday night. If you don't show up, lose our number forever. I put my phone down, feeling a massive surge of adrenaline. Daniel just watched me, shaking his head with a quiet, amused chuckle. He knew I couldn't just let it go. We spent the rest of the weekend resting, recovering from the emotional drain, and getting Daniel's one good suit pressed and ready for the massive event. When Monday evening finally rolled around, the air felt incredibly electric. We drove downtown to the massive city convention center. As we walked through the huge glass double doors, my stomach was tied in absolute knots, constantly scanning the massive crowd of attendees for my parents. I genuinely didn't know if my father's massive, fragile ego would actually allow him to show up after the explosive argument we had on Sunday morning. But I knew one thing for absolute certain. Tonight was going to change absolutely everything. The massive downtown convention center was absolutely buzzing with energy when we walked through the main doors. It wasn't just a small school assembly. This was a massive, highly produced state event. The main auditorium was incredibly large, designed to hold a huge crowd, and it was quickly filling up. As we walked down the heavily carpeted aisle toward the front row, I couldn't help but look around at the sheer scale of it all. There were local news cameras set up in the back, state officials mingling in expensive suits, and easily 600 people finding their seats in the grand room. Daniel held Lucas's hand, casually chatting with a few other teachers who had recognized him, looking completely relaxed. He was wearing his best charcoal suit, the one we had hurriedly pressed the night before, and he looked incredibly handsome. I, on the other hand, was a nervous wreck. Every time the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium swung open, my head snapped around. I was waiting to see if my ultimatum had actually worked. I didn't know if my father's massive pride would allow him to walk into a room where he wasn't the center of attention, especially after the explosive screaming match we had just yesterday morning. 10 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I saw them. My mother walked in first, looking incredibly anxious, clutching her small purse tightly against her chest. And right behind her, looking completely out of his element and visibly uncomfortable, was my father. He wasn't wearing his usual smug, controlling smirk. He looked deeply irritated, probably furious that I had practically forced him to drive downtown on a Monday night to attend an event he considered entirely beneath him. I stood up and waved them over to the VIP section where our front row seats were reserved. My father walked down the aisle, his eyes darting around the massive, elegant room, clearly taking in the high production value of the event. He didn't say a single word to me as he sat down in the plush velvet seat right next to mine. My mother gave me a quick, tight hug, her eyes darting nervously toward my father. Daniel, sitting on my other side with Lucas on his lap, simply leaned over, smiled politely, and gave my parents a calm nod. He didn't gloat. He didn't look angry. He was completely at peace. The lights in the massive auditorium slowly dimmed, and a hush fell over the 600 people in the crowd. The state superintendent of education walked out onto the brightly lit stage, standing behind a polished wooden podium. He adjusted his microphone and began to speak about the profound importance of education, the grueling dedication required to be a teacher, and the rigorous, months-long selection process for the State Teacher of the Year award. I glanced sideways at my father. He was sitting with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead. He was a man who only respected power, money, and influence. He was sitting there waiting for a boring presentation about test scores and curriculum metrics. He had absolutely no idea what was actually about to happen. Tonight, the superintendent announced, his voice echoing loudly through the massive room, we are not just handing out a plaque to celebrate academic excellence. We are honoring a man who has fundamentally changed the trajectory of countless young lives. To truly understand why Daniel Hayes was selected out of tens of thousands of educators across the state, we decided that the state board shouldn't be the ones to tell you. Instead, we invited the people who know his impact best. The superintendent stepped back, and the crowd applauded politely. A young man, probably in his early 20s, walked confidently out onto the stage. He was wearing a sharp, well-fitted navy suit. He walked up to the microphone, took a deep breath, and looked directly out into the audience. He found Daniel sitting in the front row and smiled warmly. My name is Marcus, the young man began, his voice steady but carrying a heavy emotional weight. 7 years ago, I was a sophomore in Mr. Hayes' history class. But I wasn't learning much history back then because I was constantly falling asleep at my desk. I was angry, I was failing all of my classes, and I was entirely ready to drop out of school completely. The massive room was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. I looked at my father, and for the first time all night, his arms weren't crossed. He was leaning forward slightly, actually listening to the young man on the stage. What nobody at the school knew, Marcus continued, his voice cracking just a fraction, was that my mom had lost her job and we had been evicted from our apartment. I was homeless. I was sleeping in the back seat of a broken-down car in a grocery store parking lot every single night. I felt a sharp lump form in my throat. Daniel had never told me this specific story. He always kept his students' personal struggles completely confidential. Marcus gripped the edges of the podium. Mr. Hayes noticed. He didn't send me to the principal's office for sleeping in class. He didn't shame me in front of the other kids. He just quietly pulled me aside one day after the bell rang and asked me what was really going on. When I finally broke down and told him the truth, he didn't pity me. He took immediate action. For the next 8 months, Mr. Hayes drove out of his way every single morning to find that parking lot. Mr. Hayes drove me to school every day. He brought me breakfast. He stayed with me after hours to help me catch up on my missing assignments. He made sure I graduated. Marcus paused, wiping a single tear from his eye. Today, I am an architectural engineer. I design the kinds of homes I didn't have when I was 16. And none of that, absolutely none of it, would have been possible if a history teacher hadn't decided that my life was worth saving. The entire auditorium erupted into massive, deafening applause. I looked over at Daniel. He was smiling softly, his eyes shining with unshed tears as he looked up at his former student. I then looked at my father. The smug, arrogant mask he always wore was completely gone. His face was entirely pale. He was staring at the stage, his mouth slightly open, completely unable to process what he had just heard, but the state board wasn't done. As Marcus walked off the stage to another massive round of applause, a young woman walked up to the microphone. She looked incredibly polished, confident, and professional, carrying herself with an intense, powerful energy. "My name is Sarah," she said smoothly, projecting her voice effortlessly across the large room. "And I was, without a doubt, the absolute worst student Mr. Hayes ever had." A light ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Daniel chuckled quietly next to me. I was incredibly rebellious, constantly in trouble, and I hated authority, Sarah continued, her smile fading into a look of deep sincerity. I grew up in a really rough neighborhood. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college, and nobody expected me to go either. Society had basically written me off before I even turned 15. I was fully prepared to just become another negative statistic. She looked down at Daniel in the front row. But Mr. Hayes refused to let me fail. When I acted out, he didn't yell. When I tried to push him away, he pushed right back with harder assignments and higher expectations. He saw an intellect in me that I didn't even know existed. He spent entirely too many of his own lunch breaks forcing me to debate historical court cases with him, teaching me how to channel my deep anger into structured, logical arguments. He helped me fill out every single one of my college applications because I didn't have anyone at home who knew how to do it. Sarah stood up incredibly straight, radiating an undeniable pride. I am standing here today as a junior partner at one of the top corporate defense firms in the city. I'm a lawyer because he believed in me. I immediately turned my head to look at my father. His eyes were wide, completely locked onto Sarah. He worshipped corporate lawyers. He spent his entire life trying to impress people exactly like the incredibly successful, powerful woman standing on that stage. And right there, in front of 600 people, this highly successful corporate lawyer had just publicly declared that she owed her entire prestigious career to the exact same high school teacher my father had viciously mocked just 48 hours ago. The reality of the situation was hitting my father like a massive, speeding freight train. He was a man who built giant, empty buildings out of concrete and steel. But the quiet, humble man sitting right next to him, the man he called a glorified babysitter, actually built human beings. The applause for Sarah was even louder than before. It echoed off the high ceilings of the convention center, a roaring wave of profound respect and deep admiration from hundreds of people. The superintendent walked back up to the microphone, smiling broadly at the incredibly emotional crowd. "Marcus and Sarah are just 2 examples out of thousands," the superintendent said clearly over the fading applause. "Daniel Hayes doesn't just teach history. He fundamentally changes the future. It is my absolute honor to introduce the State Teacher of the Year. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Daniel Hayes." As my husband gently lifted Lucas off his lap and stood up, the entire room shifted. What happened next was the single most powerful, undeniable validation I have ever witnessed in my entire life, and it set the stage for a speech that my father would never, ever forget. Daniel gently lifted Lucas off his lap, setting him down in his seat next to me, and gave my hand a quick, reassuring squeeze. He stood up and began the long walk down the center aisle toward the brightly lit stage. He didn't rush, and he didn't swagger. He just walked with the exact same calm, steady confidence he carried every single day when he walked into his high school classroom. The applause from the 600 people in the auditorium was absolutely deafening, echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings of the convention center. I looked to my right and saw my father staring blankly at the stage, his jaw tightly locked. When Daniel reached the stage, the state superintendent shook his hand warmly and handed him a massive, heavy glass trophy engraved with his name and the state seal. Daniel took it gracefully, but he didn't hold it up like a massive prize to show off. He carefully set it down on the wooden shelf of the podium, completely ignoring the physical award. He leaned forward, adjusting the microphone slightly, and looked out over the massive sea of faces. He didn't have any prepared notes. He didn't have cue cards. He just looked directly into the crowd, his eyes scanning the front rows until he finally found Marcus and Sarah. "Thank you," Daniel started, his deep, soothing voice instantly commanding the attention of the entire room. "To Marcus, to Sarah, and to all the students who allowed me to be a small part of their incredible journeys. You are the reason I wake up every morning. You are the reason I do this job." He paused, letting the heavy, emotional weight of the previous speeches settle over the audience. He looked down at his hands resting on the edges of the podium, and then he slowly lifted his head. His eyes bypassed me, bypassed my mother, and locked directly onto my father sitting rigidly in the front row. "Someone told me this weekend that teaching is babysitting," Daniel said, his voice carrying perfectly through the massive, silent room. A light, amused ripple of laughter spread through the auditorium. The crowd assumed he was just making a self-deprecating joke, a humorous little anecdote about the common misconceptions of the teaching profession. But I knew exactly who he was quoting, and so did my father. I watched my father visibly stiffen in his plush velvet seat, his face suddenly draining of all remaining color. Daniel let the laughter completely fade away until the room was absolutely silent again. His expression hardened just a fraction, shifting from polite gratitude to fierce, undeniable conviction. "Maybe it is," Daniel continued, leaning closer to the microphone, his voice dropping an octave. "But sometimes babysitting saves a life." The impact of those words was like a massive physical shockwave rolling through the convention center. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was a profound, undeniable truth. Daniel stood incredibly tall behind the podium, radiating a quiet, absolute authority that no amount of money could ever buy. He didn't need to scream. He didn't need to insult anyone, and he didn't need to brag about his bank account. He just stood there, a man who literally saved children from the streets, and let his life's work speak for itself. For a split second, nobody moved. And then, as if pulled by an invisible, undeniable force, an older teacher in the third row stood up and started clapping. Then 3 more people stood, then a dozen. Within 10 seconds, all 600 people in that massive auditorium were on their feet, delivering a thunderous, roaring standing ovation. The sound was completely overwhelming, a massive tidal wave of pure, unadulterated respect. That I stood up, tears streaming freely down my face, cheering as loudly as I possibly could for the incredible man I was lucky enough to call my husband. I looked down at Lucas, who was clapping his small hands together, a massive, proud smile on his face. And then I looked to my right. My father was the very last person to stand. He didn't want to. I could see the intense, painful internal struggle playing out on his face. He was a man whose entire worldview was actively crumbling to dust right in front of him. But he was surrounded by 600 highly respected professionals, state officials, and successful lawyers, all giving their utmost respect to a man my father had publicly humiliated just 2 days ago. Social pressure and undeniable reality finally broke him. Slowly, stiffly, my father got to his feet. He didn't clap. He just stood there, looking incredibly small, staring up at Daniel with a look of absolute, profound defeat. The applause lasted for several long minutes before Daniel finally gave a humble wave, picked up his glass trophy, and walked off the stage. The rest of the ceremony was a complete blur. When the event finally concluded, the massive crowd began to slowly filter out of the auditorium and into the grand lobby for the post-ceremony reception. I held Lucas's hand as we navigated through the sea of people. Everyone wanted to shake Daniel's hand. Former students, state board members, and fellow teachers were crowding around him, offering their congratulations and sharing quick, emotional stories. I stood back slightly, watching him handle the overwhelming attention with his usual grace and humility. That was when I felt a presence beside me, I turned and saw my father standing a few feet away. He wasn't surrounded by his wealthy business partners. He wasn't holding an expensive glass of champagne. He was just standing awkwardly near a large marble pillar, waiting for the crowd around Daniel to finally thin out. My mother stood slightly behind him, her eyes red from crying during the speeches. After about 20 minutes, the immediate rush of well-wishers finally dispersed, leaving Daniel standing near a quiet corner of the lobby. He was holding his heavy glass award, taking a deep breath. My father slowly walked over to him. I immediately stepped forward, ready to intervene, ready to aggressively shut down any passive-aggressive comments my father might try to make. But Daniel caught my eye and gave me a barely noticeable shake of his head. He had this under control. My father stopped about 2 feet in front of Daniel. He looked at the massive, gleaming State Teacher of the Year award, and then he looked up into Daniel's face. The smug, arrogant, calculating businessman I had known my entire life was completely gone. In his place was an old, severely humbled man who had just realized he had spent the last 6 years entirely, completely wrong. For a long, tense moment, the two men just looked at each other. The bustling noise of the reception echoed around us, but their corner of the lobby felt entirely isolated. My father opened his mouth to speak, closed it, and then swallowed hard. He couldn't rely on his money right now. He couldn't rely on his social status. I didn't know, my father finally said, his voice shockingly quiet and incredibly hoarse, that it was the closest thing to an admission of guilt I had ever heard him utter in my entire 32 years of life. He was admitting that he had judged a book strictly by its cover, that he had blindly equated a teaching salary with a lack of ambition, and that he had absolutely no idea the profound, life-altering impact my husband had on the world. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't rub the glass award in my father's face, and he didn't demand a groveling apology for the horrific anniversary dinner. He just looked at my father with that exact same steady, unflinching gaze he had used all weekend. "You didn't ask," Daniel replied evenly. The response was incredibly simple, but it hit harder than a physical punch. It was the absolute, undeniable truth. In 6 long years, my father had never once asked Daniel about his students. He had never once asked him why he chose to teach. He had never asked about his passions, his challenges, or his triumphs. He had taken one single look at Daniel's profession, assigned a monetary value to it, and completely dismissed him as a human being. My father just stood there, completely silent. He had absolutely nothing left to say. There was no argument he could make, no check he could write, and no insult he could throw that would ever restore his deeply fractured ego. He slowly nodded his head, his shoulders slumping, and took a step back. Without another word, he turned around and slowly walked away through the crowded lobby, with my mother following quietly behind him. I watched him leave, feeling a strange, complicated mix of emotions. But mostly, I just felt an overwhelming, undeniable sense of pride as I turned back to my husband, the man who had just proven to the entire world exactly what true value looks like. The drive back to our small, quiet neighborhood that Monday night felt entirely different than the agonizing drive we had taken just 24 hours earlier. The suffocating, heavy tension that had been crushing my chest all weekend was completely gone, replaced by a profound, undeniable sense of peace. When we finally walked through our front door, Daniel didn't treat the massive glass trophy like a sacred artifact. He didn't clear off a special shelf in the living room or demand that we stare at it. He simply set the heavy award down on the cluttered kitchen counter, right next to a stack of ungraded history essays and a cup full of his red grading pens. The very next morning, Daniel woke up at his usual 5:30 a.m., brewed a pot of cheap coffee, packed his worn-out leather messenger bag, and drove his modest car right back to the high school. He didn't ask for a parade, he didn't want any special treatment from the principal, and he certainly didn't let the prestigious title inflate his ego. He just walked back into his classroom, smiled at his rowdy teenagers, and started teaching the exact same way he had for the last 10 years. His profound humility was honestly staggering to witness, especially after spending an entire weekend suffocating in my father's world of endless bragging and extreme arrogance. But while Daniel was perfectly content to quietly return to his normal life, the rest of the city was not going to let his incredible achievement go unnoticed. On Wednesday morning, the local news published a massive, highly detailed article about the awards ceremony. It wasn't just a tiny, easily ignored paragraph buried in the back pages of the community section. It was a massive, front-page feature in the city's largest and most widely circulated newspaper. The journalist who wrote the piece had been in the auditorium that night, and they captured the intense emotional weight of the entire event perfectly. The massive headline didn't just mention the award, it focused entirely on Daniel's profound impact on his community. The article explicitly quoted the incredibly moving, tear-filled speeches from Marcus and Sarah, detailing exactly how Daniel had rescued a homeless teenager from a grocery store parking lot and guided a troubled, rebellious young girl toward a highly successful career in corporate law. It painted a vivid, undeniable picture of a man who was actively, selflessly changing the world, one student at a time. By Wednesday afternoon, that exact same local news article had made its way directly into my father's exclusive, highly manicured world. Copies of the newspaper were sitting on the expensive glass coffee tables of the local country club. The link to the digital article was being actively shared and discussed in the elite corporate boardrooms where my father spent all of his time trying to impress his wealthy peers, the 70 guests who had sat at that long, extravagant banquet table just a few days prior, the same people who had awkwardly stared at their expensive plates while my father viciously mocked my husband, were now staring at a front-page photograph of Daniel holding the highest educational honor in the entire state. The wealthy friends of my father read the article in complete shock. They read about the thunderous, 600-person standing ovation. They read about the highly successful corporate lawyer who publicly credited her entire prestigious career to Daniel's tireless dedication. This was the exact moment when the entire fabricated reality my father had carefully constructed completely collapsed, and the absolute truth was finally exposed to everyone. My older sister called me on Thursday evening, her voice a mixture of absolute disbelief and quiet amusement, to tell me about the massive fallout happening in my father's social circle. She told me that the country club was absolutely buzzing with intense, relentless gossip. For weeks leading up to the anniversary party, my father had been walking around telling all of his wealthy friends and business partners that my marriage was completely failing. He had actively spread a malicious, entirely fabricated rumor that Daniel was a pathetic failure who was dragging me down into a miserable, impoverished life, and that I was desperately looking for a way out. But the massive feature article in the newspaper completely destroyed his cruel narrative. The article featured a beautiful, candid photograph of our family taken in the lobby after the ceremony. It showed Daniel, Lucas, and me standing close together, smiling genuinely, radiating an undeniable, fierce unity. My father's wealthy friends immediately realized that he had explicitly lied to them to protect his own massive, fragile ego. They realized that the man my father had publicly labeled as a glorified, underpaid babysitter was actually a highly respected, deeply honorable community leader. My father's reputation in his elite circles took a massive, embarrassing hit. He didn't look like a powerful, protective patriarch anymore. He looked exactly like what he was, a bitter, lying, deeply insecure old man who had actively alienated his own daughter because he was utterly obsessed with social status. People at his club started giving him strange, pitying looks. His business partners awkwardly avoided bringing up the anniversary party. The social validation he so desperately craved, the validation he had built his entire life around, was suddenly and completely gone. For the first time in his 70 years of life, my father was forced into a corner that his millions of dollars absolutely could not buy him out of. He was sitting completely alone in his sprawling, silent brick mansion. My mother, usually his quiet shadow, had reportedly started spending most of her time in the nursery they had built for Lucas, quietly weeping over the wooden crib, refusing to speak to my father or entertain his angry outbursts at my father had spent his entire life measuring human value entirely by the size of a bank account, completely oblivious to the fact that true respect is earned through character, not purchased with a massive paycheck. He had spent 6 years firmly believing that he was punishing me by cutting me out of his wealthy life, fully expecting me to eventually come crawling back, begging for his financial help and his conditional approval. But as he sat in his massive, empty leather chair, staring down at the newspaper article featuring the son-in-law he had mercilessly bullied, the heavy, crushing weight of his colossal mistake finally settled over him. He realized that we didn't need his money. We didn't need his massive house, his luxury cars, or his elite country club memberships to be incredibly happy. We had built a beautiful, meaningful life entirely without him, that he had pushed away the only daughter who dared to stand up to him. He had completely missed the first 6 years of his only grandson's life, and he had viciously disrespected a profoundly good man who had only ever treated his daughter with absolute love and unwavering support. The silence in his massive mansion grew louder and more agonizing with every passing hour. He walked down the long, sweeping hallway and stopped in front of the heavy oak door that led to Lucas's nursery. He looked at the expensive, untouched toys sitting perfectly arranged on the thick carpet. He finally understood that he could buy all the handcrafted wooden cribs in the world, but he couldn't buy a family's genuine love to be why Friday morning. The suffocating guilt and profound isolation became entirely too much for him to bear. The stubborn, impenetrable wall of pride that had dictated his every move for decades finally began to crack and crumble. He walked slowly back into his large mahogany office, the exact same room where he had coldly kicked me out of his life 6 years ago. He sat down behind his massive desk, ignoring his financial documents and his real estate portfolios. His hands were physically shaking as he reached across the polished wood and picked up his expensive phone. He stared at the screen for a long, agonizing time, knowing that the call he was about to make would require him to completely surrender his ego. He had to face the daughter he had wronged, and he had to somehow find the words to apologize for a lifetime of toxic behavior. He took a deep, shaky breath, dialed my number, and held the phone to his ear, waiting to see if I would even answer. The phone vibrated loudly against the kitchen counter. I was in the middle of pouring my second cup of coffee before heading out to the hospital for a long shift. I glanced down at the bright screen and completely froze. The caller ID displayed my father's name. For a long, tense moment, I just stared at it. My thumb hovered over the red reject button. After the horrific, toxic weekend we had just endured, and the absolute humiliation he suffered after the newspaper article exposed his lies to all his wealthy friends, I honestly didn't know what he could possibly want to say. I took a deep breath, braced myself for another screaming match, and slowly swiped the green button to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear but didn't say a word. I wanted him to speak first. For several agonizing seconds, there was only heavy, static silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing heavily, the sound of a proud man physically struggling to swallow his massive ego. "Elena," he finally said, his voice sounding incredibly frail and utterly exhausted. "I'm here," I replied cautiously, my guard entirely up. There was another long pause. And then he said the 3 words I had never, ever heard him say to anyone in my entire 32 years of existence. I was wrong. The admission hung in the air, heavy and loaded with years of stubborn mistakes. He didn't try to justify his actions at the anniversary party. He didn't try to blame my mother, or Ryan Caldwell, or the country club gossip. He just admitted his own fundamental failure. He told me that sitting alone in his massive, empty house, reading that front-page article about the lives my husband had saved, broke something deep inside of him. He realized he had traded his only daughter and his only grandson for a pathetic illusion of social superiority. I leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, closing my eyes. A part of me, the little girl who just wanted her dad's approval, wanted to immediately burst into tears and tell him everything was okay. But I was a grown woman, a mother, and a fiercely protective wife. I couldn't just sweep 6 years of abandonment and a weekend of vicious public mockery under the rug. I had to establish absolute, unbreakable rules right then and there. "I appreciate you saying that, Dad," I said, my voice steady and completely unwavering. "But an apology doesn't magically erase what happened. You actively tried to destroy my marriage. You tried to humiliate Daniel in front of 70 people. You lied to your friends about my life." "I know," he whispered. "I know what I did. I want to fix it, Elena. I want to see Lucas. I want to be a family. If you want to be a part of this family, things are going to be entirely different," I told him, setting the absolute boundaries we desperately needed. "You do not get to bring your money into my house. You do not get to make passive-aggressive comments about our lifestyle. And most importantly, you will treat Daniel with the absolute highest level of respect." That I took a sharp breath, making sure he understood the absolute gravity of my next sentence. "If you cannot respect my husband, you will not get to see your grandson. Ever, that in the past, giving my father an ultimatum like that would have resulted in an explosive, terrifying rage. He would have hung up the phone, cut up my credit cards, and ban me from his property. But the man on the other end of the phone wasn't a powerful, untouchable billionaire anymore. He was just a lonely, deeply regretful grandfather who had finally realized the actual cost of his extreme arrogance that he didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just let out a long, shaky sigh. "I'll try," he promised quietly. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't expect him to completely change his entire personality overnight. I knew there would be awkward dinners, tense moments, and a massive learning curve as he tried to navigate a world that didn't revolve entirely around wealth and status. But saying he would try was a massive, unprecedented step in the right direction. We talked for a few more minutes, agreeing to start with a very short, highly supervised lunch at a neutral restaurant the following weekend. When I hung up the phone, Daniel walked into the kitchen, already dressed in his faded button-down shirt, holding his worn-out leather messenger bag. He looked at my face, immediately sensing the heavy emotional shift in the room. I walked over to him, wrapped my arms tightly around his waist, and buried my face in his chest. I told him everything my father had just said. I told him about the apology, the strict boundaries I had set, and the quiet promise my father had made. Daniel just held me, gently rubbing my back. He wasn't angry that I was giving my father another chance. He didn't hold a bitter grudge. He just smiled his warm, steady smile, kissed the top of my head, and told me he was incredibly proud of me. That was exactly who Daniel was. He was a man of infinite patience and profound grace, a man who built bridges instead of burning them. Over the next few months, the dynamic of my family slowly began to shift. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy. My father came to our modest house for dinner one Sunday evening. He looked incredibly out of place sitting on our cheap, mass-produced sofa, drinking tap water out of a plain glass. But he didn't complain. He didn't mention Ryan Caldwell, he didn't talk about his massive real estate deals, and he didn't offer to buy us a bigger house. Instead, he actually sat down on the living room rug with Lucas and played with a set of battered plastic cars for over an hour. More surprisingly, he actually started talking to Daniel. Not talking down to him, but actually having genuine, respectful conversations. He asked Daniel about his history classes. He asked about the challenges the students were facing in the current educational system. He listened, truly listened, when Daniel explained how he built his lesson plans to engage teenagers who had completely given up on themselves. For the first time in his life, my father was learning how to value a man not for what he possessed, but for what he contributed to the world. My mother, free from the suffocating pressure of my father's constant social climbing, finally started to relax. She visited us constantly, baking cookies with Lucas and helping me fold laundry after my exhausting hospital shifts. The massive, cold brick mansion they lived in finally started to feel less like a museum and more like a place we could actually visit without fear of judgment. Looking back on that horrific anniversary weekend, I realized it was the absolute best thing that could have ever happened to us. It forced the massive, toxic infection in my family out into the open, and it finally allowed us to heal. It exposed the absolute absurdity of my father's worldview, and it highlighted the profound, undeniable beauty of my husband's life choices. My father had spent his entire life measuring human value entirely by money, desperately chasing social status and financial dominance. He thought a massive paycheck was the ultimate shield against the world. But Daniel, the quiet, humble high school history teacher, proved that true worth is measured by the deep, lasting impact you have on the people around you. He proved that saving a single troubled teenager from the streets is worth infinitely more than any luxury resort or 80-foot yacht. We don't live in a gated community, and we don't drive expensive sports cars. But when I look at my husband, the man who quietly changes the future every single day he walks into his classroom, I know I am married to the richest man in the world. Because at the end of the day, the truth is incredibly simple. Respect isn't measured by a paycheck. It's measured by the lives you change.